Thank you, Victor, and thank you for the honor of being here today. I'm soaking it in, and I have much to learn, and I'm here as a student. But I have, with the team, been looking at the T3010 form. And what is this T3010 form? It is the reason that we looked at it, the reason we unpacked it, it is that it is the only thing that every charity in the country has in common. And that's really where the conversation started. How can we build community? What is our commonality? And it's that some poor soul in 80,000 charities across the country every year needs to fill out a form and submit it to the CRA about all the things that it does. But the way in which the questions are asked, the 15 million data points that each of the T3010 years represents, is like almost dead on arrival, because what each of those 80,000 people have to wrestle with is a form that is outdated and is narrow in terms of what it's trying to measure. On the other hand, what is beautiful about the T3010 is that it is the only mandatory filing for the sector. So if we can get our hands on what's in there and start to make it matter, because we're obligated to do it, there is so much to unpack. And what we've been working on at Capital W is putting the data scientists and the work in service to sectors so that they have the data and are able to unpack this incredible effort that year after year after year, all of these charities fill it out, send it in, and it's not even cleaned. So my curiosity around the T3010, there's so many things. One is that, why doesn't it matter? Why is it treated in a way that it doesn't matter? How is it that there's $1 trillion moving through the charitable sector over the next 4 years, and very few people are paying attention to what's happening? How is it that we are separated and siloed and not able to connect? And so the hope around this is that strangely, this form can be a form of community building. And it was the form that was part of the unfunded data that was used. And so it matters and it's there. And so we're really wanting to mine this in a way that puts it back in the hands of people that can, and groups that have been marginalized, and shifting the power so that the groups can set the table instead of being invited to the table. And it's been a really, really interesting journey. And my hope is that as this matters, as this starts to matter, that there will be ways of engaging with that data in the way that serves and nourishes. I've really appreciated the conversation today about what is alive. And one of the things to me that colonialism is about is making something kind of reductive and dead, sanitizing it to the point that it's not there anymore, and disconnecting it from life. It's like taking a wild English garden and trying to get it in rows and make sure that this doesn't go over there. And there's instead of being present with life. And if there's a way in which we can harness all the efforts of charities, because they're on the front lines every day of what's alive. And if we can have that communicated in data, we can, and put it into the hands of the groups on the margins, I think that the best is yet to come.
Thank you, Catherine. I'll echo Randall and just say, well said. Data that serves and nourishes will really stay with me. Narinder, great to see you. You are leading in so many spaces right now, but let's talk about your work with New Power Labs, and wondering what are some of the regulatory and privacy issues that you're seeing right now in our data landscape?
No, just to echo, I think there's such a great conversation, rich conversation so far, and really appreciate kind of the power of how we hold our data, who holds it, how we collect it, what we use for it. And I don't always think we put the right focus and attention there. So some context on New Power Lab. So we are a think tank, do tank, and we look at how capital flows across diversity types. And so diversity lenses, so from gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, citizenship status, language minority, abilities, and I know I'm missing a few as I kind of run off the list. And how can we look at, how can we center the user? So in our situation is the deployer of capital, because we're working with them to secure that data on a holistic level, so we can disaggregate that and understand how capital is flowing, what is trending. I think that in our sector, in the social sector, we are good people doing good work. And we get caught in this kind of good, bad, kind of binary mindset. And sometimes those good intentions are insufficient to drive the impact that we want, and who we trust isn't perhaps aligned with those bold equity statements that we have on our foundation websites, or so there's a lot there to unpack. And as we think through how capital flows for us, thinking about capital should align directly with any type of work you're doing, the values of your foundation, the equity that you've stated as a foundation or any type of capital deployer. So, in doing so, privacy is so critical. So what we're looking at is we're looking at who holds power, makes decisions, and deploys capital, and their disaggregated demographic data, and then who receives capital and their teams, and what that disaggregated demographic data looks like. There are huge amounts of privacy considerations as part of that. And they vary as well, because somebody who holds power, privacy is a little different than somebody who doesn't hold power and has risk to being exploited or other types of negative harm that can come with realizing and being public about identity. So we're spending a lot of time right now. We're in kind of prototype mode of ensuring that the right data policies are there to protect the individuals, and particularly the individuals that hold less power in these structures, so that there is safety and in them disclosing that data for us. And it's critical that we get this. And I think it's been noted as like, we know how capital flows in our sector, in social innovation, in philanthropy. That's not net new. And it's unfortunate that we need to have data to prove out the kind of case for support of getting more capital to communities that are underfunded and overlooked. But that is a reality. And what we want to do in New Power Labs is that let's collect that data. Let's see how it changes over time. Let's create that transparency and that accountability at the level of capital deployers, whether they're foundations, impact investment funds, so that we can ensure that the statements on equity are matching the statements and the types of flow of capital that are being executed by these organizations. And I on the other side of my hat, I do run a private family foundation, and we're trying to live those values and funding predominantly grassroots organizations and diverse leaders in that process. And we'll be the first to disclose kind of and share how we're flowing capital. Going back to privacy and governance, and that is critical. And so, we actually are looking at the learnings from the healthcare system, where when you think about health data and the protection of health data, how can we mirror that as we're building out our internal infrastructure to ensure kind of the safety exists with the very sensitive disaggregated demographic data? And maybe I'll pause there, but I think that the opportunity, hopefully, and I think an openness exists in this moment to start to look at that. And actually, there's one other thing I'd like to share. So yesterday, actually, I'm in Ottawa right now, and last night I was at the IRPP Gala, and they had a panel in advance on racism and policy. And one of the panelists they noted that we always talk about Canadians just don't want to collect race data. They just don't want to. And she asked a question. So she's a Black woman. She asked a question. She's like, which Canadians? Who doesn't want to collect race-based data? It's not her. It's not the other people of color panelists who were part of that discussion. So whose views, whose ideas, whose preferences are we centering by not collecting this really critical data that can advance ultimately equity and impact across the country?
I love that. Thank you so much for all those actionable insights, Narinder, and your brilliance as always. We really appreciate you. And we're going to move on to our colleague, Arlene. Arlene, in your work with at the federal level and working within the charitable sector, do you see a need for data to be decolonized? And is data neutral?
Data is far from neutral. I think numbers can perhaps be inherently neutral. And, I'll use an example of 1%. We say 1%. It has no meaning, it's just a number. But if I say that's the margin of error on my son's last science test, it means something completely different. Now it has meaning. Or if I say that's the percentage of grants going to Black-led organizations, now that 1%, that number is no longer neutral. And the decolonizing data is essential because we use the T3010 and we tell two different stories from those same numbers. So we use that $100 billion assets, for example, and it was used for a whole campaign around increasing the grants at the same time that we have an unfunded report saying that, wait a sec, there's not $100 billion of assets in the sector. We only have 1% of those assets. So your worldview and your interpretation of that data, that's where we need to decolonize the data. It's not the number itself that needs to be decolonized. It's how we collect it, who's collecting it, the technology and the creator of that technology. All of those things are where we need to focus our attention. And then it's the interpretation, because if we take that number, and I'm going to use it as an example because it was my experience when I was leading the charitable sector data working group of 100 billion. And we take the stories away from that number, which we do when we focus just on data. And despite leading a charitable sector data working group, I am of a mind that our focus on data being what qualifies as evidence is a colonized mindset and perspective. The stories that we tell in different cultures are the way we transfer knowledge, and it is how we apply meaning to our experiences and we share those experiences, and the numbers themselves, we lose all of that. That's, to me, where the real meaning of what these numbers are is. It's in the stories. And so, thinking about decolonizing data to me is really the starting point, and I think it's been mentioned several times. But if we just land with that story of $100 billion of assets in the sector, completely ignores the fact that there's 80,000 organizations in the sector and less than 10 of them hold 50% of that $100 billion. And the rest of us are sharing in our scarcity the other assets. And so without decolonizing and without looking and seeking to interpret what that story is really telling us, we don't really understand what that number is. So allowing numbers to remain neutral, I think, is dangerous. And allowing numbers and data to be the only story that we tell is also dangerous. Making policy decisions based on just data and numbers and without consulting or hearing from or including and participating and asking, is this the right information? Who should be collecting this information? Who should own this information? Because government, in my opinion, is a colonized institute of systems. And within that system, there's people with heart and passion for all of these things, but their ability to connect with the heart and passion of the story that information is collecting, I think, requires a personal connection that numbers don't give us. And so for me, decolonizing data means thinking about not what the number is saying, but what the people who that number is about have to say about the data. And the power in numbers is generally held by the people that are collecting and governing and storing those numbers. And too often in Canada, those numbers are about people, not with people. So I don't believe that data is in any way neutral, and nor are the stories we even are still telling about data, are they decolonized. So, this group effort to come together and share our stories, I am absolutely, thrilled to be here to sit and listen in place to the stories that people are telling as a cisgendered, woman from a rural community in Mi'kmaq, where we have I think our context, our worldview is really important, and we have to acknowledge what that worldview is when we bring ourselves into these spaces. I live in a community where we have a Black community, we have an Indigenous community, and we have less than 50,000 people, but we have 7 forms of government because we cannot even think to work together or to amalgamate. And our Black population lives in one area and it's poverty ridden, and our First Nations live in another. Nobody lives outside of those communities in my communities, and we have 6 municipal governments and 1 band council. And it's my perspective of the stories we tell. The real stories are when we lift the cover off of the box and we look deeply into communities about what's really happening, and we look deeply into the numbers. And we ask the people who those numbers are about, what does this really mean? I think there's too many people that look like me leading in this space right now. And I'm happy to make room for the people whose stories need to be heard, to be telling those stories. And forums like this, I think, are absolutely essential if we're thinking about decolonizing data. And the Decolonizing Institute, I think, is an absolutely essential place to start, putting it in the power where the power needs to be put. So that's what I'll say. But I think the bottom line is there's nothing neutral about data.
Oh, Arlene, thank you so much, and thank you so much for bringing in that reality that it's not about the numbers, it's about what we do with the numbers and about who does what with them. And just want to say thanks to Louise, who's offering some real insights over in the chat here, for all that you're doing with inspiring communities to create tables where those most impacted by systems that need to be reimagined are leading the conversations about what the data means and what we need to do with it. Alana, we'll ask a question of you now, and here it is. It's kind of sort of a continuation of what we've been talking about, but how politicized is data? What are some of the colonial presumptions in data collection? And what are you seeing about processes that can decolonize data?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are others here today who can speak to this, and some of your comments in the chat have also spoken to this. I think you've heard my bias, certainly, that there's nothing that isn't political about data. So you ask me is how politicized. I think it's part of the system, and so there's nothing that isn't political about it. I guess one of the things that I would just offer, something that I have learned from others. So I sit sort of in a place of learning from different community models, and have seen some interesting things happen over time. And I think that one of the things that has been really powerful to watch, and I think, Narinder, I've heard you speak about this in other fora too, that it's also about who's resourcing who's not just flow of capital, but also who's resourcing data, its collection and its use and its analysis, who's bringing people to the table, which people are being brought to those processes. And I think also importantly, Yvonne, as you were saying, what processes are privileged as legitimate or important data collection. And I think that there are several really interesting things to take away and learn from all of this. I mean, partly the whole notion of sort of community-driven and informed priorities for data, because we haven't talked yet about sort of what priorities are being, and I think it's embedded in what everyone has said, but what are the priorities around data? What kind of information do we need, and do communities need, and community experts, and seeing community-driven and informed priorities as the expertise that we need now, have always needed, frankly. I think the other piece is around, and I'm just talking about models for a moment, around processes that can assist in decolonization, which I've learned from others and I see being developed by others much more deeply engaged in this decolonizing process. Pieces around respecting and compensating the expertise of those who have been left out of the data, who have been marginalized, and centering and resourcing it, like with the Decolonizing Data Institute, so that you're not bringing people to the table as advisors and committees who are always working pro bono from passion and from necessity and urgency, compelled to engage, when those who are actually being resourced to collect and analyze the data are inviting others to come and give precious expertise, but as pro bono experts or as advisors, rather than being centered as the experts who must be resourced. I think that's a critical part around decolonizing, is actually to compensate those who hold the critical information and know what processes will actually lead to real data and the kind of politicized data that needs to exist. I think the other thing is to create, that's why the Institute and the work that so many are doing is so important, is to create resourced spaces to actually think about ways to decolonize data, not to assume that there are 3 or 4 processes that exist that will just fix the problem, but to actually resource spaces for communities and community activists, for artists, for community frontline experts to come together and actually do the thinking of what it will take to decolonize data, not just to say, give us your 3-point objectives and your outcomes and your outputs and all of the things that actually support and resource the system of colonization. So that create resource spaces to figure out how to unpack that, challenge it, do the paradigm shift that needs to be done, just to compensate and create resources for thinking and unpacking and politicized thinking. And I think also, just offer one more thing, that, the new systems to replace what exists, to figure out how not to be extractive, to figure out how to have to completely shift the power away from privileged and exclusionary practices, as we said, as if they're neutral, and to overthrow them. That actually needs to be resourced. That's not something that should continue to be done by the urgency of communities and the experts who sit in this room and beyond. I think all of the expertise exists, and as Levon said, it's not like it's a surprise or that it isn't known. It just needs to be uplifted and supported properly.
Indeed. Thank you so much for those remarkable insights, Alana. As always, we really appreciate your leadership and diligence. So Ryan, and this actually is a perfect segue based off of some of what Alana shared. I'm sure you've been asked to sit on advisories, had your intellectual property extracted from you, your data, your lived experience, your social location, to inform a process. What do you see as some of the potential remedies around this type of data extraction?
Oh boy. And I'll say again, this is exactly why we're working on this Decolonizing Data Institute. And it isn't just from outside the Black community, it also happens inside the Black community, where you create a certain amount of data and then it's taken to be used to benefit somebody else. And that used to irk me, but at one point I did have to fight my own ego and say, you know what, if there's data that we've generated that helps somebody else further their cause, sometimes you do have to let go. But I've also been on boards and advisory councils where you start to slowly realize that you're the token and you don't have true influence or true decision-making power. And I'll give a quick example. And 3 years ago, I was able to meet with one of my inspirations, Wes Hall, and learning about stocks and proxy. And what he mentioned was, if you hold a stock, you own the stock in a company, that one vote doesn't have power. The true power comes from the collective influence that you have by connecting with others that are making decisions. And so when we're on boards, if you're just there by yourself, you actually don't have true power. And that's where I learned from Brother Victor as well, having this pact where if a person asks you to be on a board, it's not just you. You're not just the one token Black person that's going to join this board so that they can check a box. You need to have allies and people on there with you that can now allow you to have more influence. So this is where we want to bring that type of influence by having this Decolonizing Data Institute, where now it's not just about one entity trying to collect data and further their own cause. It's more collective thought. It's whatever data is happening, we're able to bring it into a central node that can be accessed and people can use it to further their causes. And again, to keep my down, and so to make sure that I'm not trying to run off and try to just further Ryan Knight, it's really about collective thought and allowing the full community to access anything that each of us are doing to further the causes across the board.
So we're gonna go back to Narinder, and we really appreciate those insights. Ryan, thank you so much. So Narinder, in the development of New Power Labs, have there been any challenges in terms of funding data work? And are you navigating any processes that are similar to some of the colonial funding frameworks that we've all had to deal with, myself included? After that question, we'll get to you, Liban. I see your hand up. Thank you, my friend. Or do you want to go first, Liban?
Liban can go first if it's.
See how much a gentleman.
Yeah,
let's see how much of a gentleman my brother from Scotland.
No, it was just it was a follow-up to Ryan, so I'm happy to wait. I mean, it's easy to be the gentleman when you told me what the right thing to do is, by the way.
Well, if you're following up, why don't you go? Because I feel like it'll build off that comment, and then I'll.
Yeah, it's one sentence. The way to feel like it's not an extractive process is use the fucking data that we give you. Okay? Sorry for swearing. Use the goddamn
100%.
data.
Yes.
Like that's. I'm happy to be extracted. I will chat with you as much as we want, but don't just sit on the knowledge that you've now learned. That's the way to not make this extractive. So use the fucking data.
Asheo, thank you, Liban. We appreciate your candor, as always, my brother. So Narinder, in the development of New Power Labs, have there been any challenges in funding your work, data work, and are you navigating any processes that are similar to some of the colonial frameworks and funding models that many of us from racialized communities struggle with, to be honest with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been operating on a very lean budget. I like we do a lot in a little, and that it goes back to, well, who's running it? A woman of color. And so when we then think about how funding is flowed to women of color, you start to understand that this is just, regardless of who I am as an individual and what track record I can show, I am still somebody who needs to go through those extra loops, extra hoops. It's a process that exists and is something that there's actually now enough research that shows that people of color get more restricted funding, they get less funding. These are things that we know. So that's not net new to the work that we're doing at New Power Labs. Now, we do have some amazing co-founders. We are working on the IRP 2.0. So we do have some really great supporters, and they are the reason that we can do the work. We have a lot more that we need to bring on to build out the full data team and the research team that we need to execute on this at scale. And we're hopeful in our conversations with folks, not only foundations, but with government, that they will join us in the journey of collecting this data, of sharing this data, of supporting individuals to flow capital more equitably across Canada. I think, as we're thinking about how we're receiving capital, we're also building out the types of questions that we're going to be having foundations and capital deployers fill out. And we are actually asking a question on restrictive capital and non-restricted capital. And then what will be really interesting is, as we collect our data, not only will we know the demographic data of who's receiving capital, we'll know how much is flowing, and we'll know how restricted that capital is. So the power of that data set to look across diversity types and understand kind of the potential bias that exists and how capital flow, I think, will be really important. When you see a lot of research funding, it's linked to universities, and right now we do not have, we're exploring university partners, And so that's another area of, you know, as we think through like who owns research, kind of who gets to decide that mandate, it does happen. It's often associated with universities and professors at this point as an independent think tank. It creates a bit more difficulty in terms of securing that support.
Thank you so much, Narinder. We really appreciate your leadership. And we have one more question for Catherine, then we're going to open up the Q&A because folks are feeding me direct messages and there's quite a few folks. So if you have a question, please get your questions ready. But the last question to Catherine before we go to the full Q&A is, what is your ultimate goal related to this work in data? Capital W's been at it for a while, and every conversation I've had, we've talked about data being a love language. And me and you actually talked about the Data is Love campaign in February. So there's a lot of remarkable things that can be done with data, and obviously it's not neutral, but based off of some of the actual insights we've heard today from all the panelists, what's your ultimate goal at Capital W and in your work with Ryan and others around the Decolonizing Data Institutes?
Thank you for that question. And I just want to step back in terms of, again, appreciation for the richness. And that's the ultimate goal, is the richness arises and can be harnessed to allow us all to thrive. And I'm reminded of where things were with gender data, whereby literally the conversation was held at the powers that be that women's bodies were too complicated, they were too hormonal to be working with in terms of health data, and so the male became the default. And so when you look on your prescriptions and it says, like on the Tylenol bottles, and it says adult dosage, that's a male dosage because it's too complicated. They have menstruation and they're this and they're that, and then they're pregnant and blah, forget it. It's simpler. And so, and you miss the whole life, the whole livelihood. And there's actually been very serious consequences for women's mortality because of that deference around it being the male. And so to me, there's what's coming of this is the opportunity to harness data and bring it to life and to put it into the service of the communities that can drive equality and social change, and that we become really adept at the very sophisticated work of data collection and analysis, but it's centered with communities that have been historically marginalized so that they can set the table and not have to wait for the invitation to sit at the table.
All right, I will be opening the floor to any questions. I know that Charlene had a question in the chat here. So you can actually contact Iana or Victor.
Conceiving of it as in a linear way as kind of a pipeline, or in whatever, however you visualize that, we've talked about kind of the constellation of what makes up the conversation around data. So I appreciated the collection of it, the intent behind it, how it's used, et cetera, et cetera. I haven't heard much, and maybe it's been said and I've missed it because I've not been tuning in, around the ownership and longer term ownership and additional usage and monetization of data that has been collected. I appreciate what Liban said about saying, extract from me, just use it. The reason I bring up the ownership and why I'm linking it to what Liban said is because some of the conversations that I have around data, particularly in Black communities, interestingly, with older Black women who have been advocates and activists all their lives and have every reason to be skeptical, but are also fatigued by how many different rounds of the same data has been collected from them, is the context under which I'm asking this ownership question. Because there are some who would say, ask us new questions instead of asking us the same question over and over and over again. So that is, I hope that's enough context I've given for somebody who's spoken so far. What about the ownership part in the context of how it is used, the ways in which it is used, and how new data that is collected is building on previous data and not resulting in fatigue from community members who feel like they're being asked the same things over again instead of being asked new things or being asked the follow-up questions based on action being taken on data that they've already provided before. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Louise.
Are there any panelists that wanted to jump in? Because I definitely so Louise, in terms of your points, I think all remarkable. And one of the things that I think of right now is the work that so my brother Jeff Sear from Raven Indigenous Capital, he's speaking on a panel at this conference on impact investing on Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard. Shameless plug. So is our colleague Robin Weisner. But with that being said, we've been working for a while now on a table called Beyond Solidarity around Black and Indigenous communities coming together, specifically around a whole bunch of things. So when you talk about the fact that certain demographics are consistently consulted, a lot of times it's an individual that's hired by an entity that plays the role, or it's an individual that's outside of the community that hires someone from the community to play a role. So we need to find ways and means to weave together these big gaps, but more importantly, find ways and means to create greater solidarity between those that have been consulted to death. And I hate the F word that the other, Liban used one F word, the F word that I hate is focus group. I'm almost not even liking community consultation anymore, but I still use it a lot in my work. So so F word for me is focus group. So in terms of your points, the ownership is key. And that's ownership that I think can be leveraged, not just for the purposes of supporting some of the underserved, marginalized communities that we're discussing today, but to build. Like, why can't we build institutions? Why do we have to just build small orgs? Why aren't there larger How come the largest Black organization in the country right now are the most nascent? Like, think about that. The largest Black organizations in Canada are the newest. So what I'm saying is, in terms of intergenerational collaboration, in terms of all the ways that we can use data, I think that you're onto something, fam, in terms of the ownership piece. So thank you for that. I'm sorry, Gigi, for jumping in. I see Heather's hand up.
Hi. So this has been a really fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed it today. And I'm wondering, part of it for me, in terms of the conversation we've had, is there's been a lot of what's needed and how we should be moving forward, or how things have been done wrong. And I'm wondering where the examples are of where it's being done right, and where are the models that we should be looking to emulate. I spend time in the environmental space looking at how traditional ecological knowledge is, integrated into Western science, and that's not done right either. Like the examples of that, are very difficult. And so I guess I'm sort of wondering, I will ask that question, and maybe it's a future session. So I'll sort of add to that. Like, I'd like to hear from the panel about that, but I'd also like to see or understand, like, what are the plans for future conversations? Because I feel like we've just had this feels like a nugget, and I want more.
I'm happy to add one thought here is, so again, on the panel yesterday, it was noted that the criminal justice system has the most robust race-based data that exists across Canada. And part of that, it's been integrated into the systems. It's very much kind of a structural way. So in terms of now, what are we doing with the data? Is that healthy? There's a lot of questions around if that's, that's kind of working in the favor of communities that are underfunded or that are marginalized in Canada. But they probably have the most robust. And then its health data has really robust, some parts of health data, depending on where you're looking, has really robust race data. And so I think about that outside of the social sector, there are really strong examples of collecting data versus that we can learn from within the social sector. I think in the social sector, there are models that are really interesting. You just haven't seen them at scale. So you have some very interesting ownership ideas of data, usually at a local level. You have a lot of things that are happening, but we haven't seen those scale in a way that other industries or other sectors and silos have taken kind of a broader, more robust kind of approach to data.